Most a magyarországi civil világ egy nagyon sajátos képet mutat. Ugyanis a civil, ellentétben a hivatásos politikussal, az egy olyan személy, illetve olyan közösség, amely alulról szerveződik, saját pénzügyi lábán áll, és önkéntes természetű. Most ehhez képest, ha megnézem a Magyarország civil világot, azt, amelyik a nyilvánosságban rendszeresen szerepel, most a norvég alap körüli viták ezt fölszínre is hozták, akkor azt látom, hogy itt fizetett politikai aktivistákkal van dolgunk. És ezek a fizetett politikai aktivisták ráadásul külföldiek által fizetett politikai aktivisták.
After Fidesz came into power in 2010, among many other things, they sat around reforming civil society legislation. And many in the sector initially thought this as a positive move because the old legislation was problematic in many ways. At the same time, for the coming few years, 2-3 years, civil society could operate more or less without any constraints or restrictions, though there have been sporadic warning signs in terms of negative media coverage.
As regards the relationship between NGOs and the government, of course this is a relationship full of tensions, but the picture has not always been as gloomy as this has become since, let's say, 2017, 2018. We were kind of accepted at government level. There was some kind of a dialogue, even though the government was not really responsive, and this is to put it mildly. So our legislative, regulatory, policy recommendations were not accepted at government level, but at least our credibility was not put into question.
The wake-up call for civil society organizations came in 2014 when 2 days after the general elections, which Fidesz won, an article appeared in one of the pro-government dailies accusing the organizations, the foundations, that manage the so-called NGO program of the EEA Norway grants as being politically biased towards the opposition and supporting organizations that are critical of the government or have a hidden agenda. The media smear campaigns were continued by harassing inspections by various government agencies, particularly the Government Control Office with dubious legal grounds, which then continued in accusations of mismanagement and fraud of the distribution of the funds, turning into criminal accusations which culminated in a house raid at our offices and at our partners' offices on the 8th of September 2014.
Last week, police raided the headquarters of the Okatás Foundation distributing grants for projects in less developed economies. Budapest accuses the foundation of using funds illegally and of being problematic because of political ties with the left. The crackdowns sharpen concern that core democratic values are under threat in Hungary.
For the domestic audience, we need it to be described as natural-born enemies who are instinctively and from the beginning genuinely mean and non-respectable. The government, as is, needs always enemies. Mr. George Soros, the migrants, the gay people or members of the non-straight sexual community, the EU, the Commission, Brussels, and the NGOs. The government is determined to cut as much of our leverage back as possible to place us in quarantine, but only in quarantine, not in a coffin.
This is also very clear from the continued governmental communication over the last couple of years, which very clearly divides civil society into good organizations and bad organizations. The good organizations being those that refrain to very traditional charitable purposes or recreational purposes, but any organization that moves beyond that and starts to advocate or speak up is immediately in the bad organization, bad civil society box. In 2017, we faced with the first restrictive legislation in the form of the so-called foreign funded law, which prescribed civil society organizations receiving funds from abroad above a certain threshold to register at the courts as foreign-funded organizations and use this stigmatizing label on their web pages and other materials.
Hungary's new NGO law went into effect on Tuesday. It requires all non-governmental organizations receiving more than 24,000 euros in financing from abroad to be registered as foreign supported and to disclose their foreign donors. The Fidesz-ruled government felt it necessary to introduce the law because of what it sees as undue influence by foreign forces.
A year later, another piece of legislation followed, the so-called Stop Soros package and the immigration tax, which particularly targeted organizations that deal with refugees and asylum seekers. This law would have made aid to refugees practically illegal, and planned to impose a 25% punitive tax on organizations that support immigration, whatever that is, because the legislation did not define what these organizations are.
The Hungarian government has introduced legislation that it calls Stop Soros, referring to billionaire financier George Soros, who wants Europe to accept millions of migrants, and which Hungary opposes.
In case someone receives money from abroad, either from an organization or from a private person, and that money is more than the amount given by Hungary, the Hungarian citizens, then there should be a fee paid. This tax would be 25% of the amount received from abroad, said the Minister of Interior.
What the government is doing, they are cutting our channels to reach out to those audiences which are important for them. We can speak to, the Budapest bubble, because that's not for the government anyway. But for more senior elderly people in the countryside, even educated people among them, well, the government is very careful to prevent us from reaching out to these audiences.
Ironically, the organizations, the major, let's say, human rights or anti-corruption organizations that were directly attacked and smeared, they were able to bank on this unwanted visibility. On the other hand, smaller organizations that operate in the countryside and are generally dependent on the local government and the local institutions, both financially and in basically every other respect. On those organizations, this kind of government approach had a very strong chilling effect.
Can we get access to public service media? Absolutely no. Do we get an access to pro-government commercial media? Very, very, very rarely. Do we get access to neutral or non-pro-government commercial media? Rarely, more and more rarely. And that's an essential part of the government tactics.
This is quite, of course, detrimental to civil society, but yet there is a third tendency, especially in the marginalized, depressed regions of the country, where people feel really left alone by the local institutions or by the state in general, where they feel they have nothing to lose. Bottom-up grassroots organizing is also taking off.
The European Commission takes note of the judgment of the Court of Justice, which confirms that the restrictions imposed by Hungary on the financing of civil society organizations from abroad are not compatible with EU law.